Commander Relvan had been stationed at the edge of the Terran quarantine sector for 4 months. And in those 4 months, nothing had happened. That was the job. Nothing happening was the entire point. The Terran quarantine sector was a wide, empty ring of space, drawn around a single yellow star, with one inhabited planet and a small moon. It had been drawn there 80 years ago, after a survey team filed a report, cataloged the species living on the third planet, and flew home. The report said the species was primitive, carbon-based, aggressive among itself but not yet capable of leaving its own gravity well in any meaningful way. They had nuclear fission. They had early space probes. They had radio signals full of music and war broadcasts and something called a sporting event. The report recommended a monitoring interval of 200 years. Then it was filed. Then it was forgotten. The Dominion had 14,000 member species to manage. One small, loud, unspacefaring civilization on a wet rock in an unremarkable star system did not require sustained attention, so they put a patrol route there instead. 2 frigates on a slow rotation. The Times, Patience of Ren Times and her sister ship, took turns sitting at the boundary, watching nothing happen, filing reports that said nothing happened, and rotating out every 4 months. Relvan had 11 days left on his rotation. He was sitting in the command chair reviewing maintenance logs when his sensor officer, a young Keth female named Osprian, made a sound he had not heard her make before. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they see something and their brain refuses to name it. "Report," he said. She didn't answer right away. "Osprian, I'm running a check," she said. Her voice was careful in the way of someone walking across ice. "They don't trust." He stood up and crossed to her station. The sensor display was running a standard sweep of the boundary zone, the same sweep it ran every 40 minutes, the same one that had returned nothing for 4 months, except that something was wrong with the return. There was a shape in the data that shouldn't be there, a displacement, a mass reading that the system kept trying to normalize and failing. "What is that?" he said. It was not a question. "That," she said, "is a gravitational shadow. Something very large just dropped out of faster-than-light travel approximately 400,000 kilometers inside the boundary." He looked at the number attached to the mass reading. He looked at it again. "That's wrong," he said. "I've run the diagnostic twice." "Run it again." She ran it again. The number didn't change. Relvan was a practical man. He had been in the Dominion Patrol Service for 19 years. He had seen equipment malfunctions, sensor ghosts, spatial anomalies caused by rogue stellar objects, and once a collision with a debris cloud that had taken out 3 sensor arrays and made the ship read as though it was sitting inside a small moon. He had seen a lot of things that turned out to be equipment problems. He told himself this was an equipment problem. "Pull up visual," he said. Osprian pulled up visual. The screen showed stars, the standard star field of the sector boundary. Familiar, unchanged, boring, except that a section of it was missing. Not dark, not a void, just gone. A shape cut out of the star field like something had been placed in front of it. Something solid enough that the stars behind it ceased to exist. Something that sat there in the silence of space and did not move. Relvan stared at it. "That," Osprian said very quietly, "is an occultation shadow. Whatever that object is, it is large enough to block the stellar background at this range." He did the math without wanting to. At this range, an occultation shadow that size meant the object was... He stopped doing the math. "Pull the anomaly report from the archive," he said. "Last 30 years. Anything in this sector." She pulled it. The archive returned. 30 years of boring. Micrometeorite impacts. A solar flare cycle from the Terran star. One logged instance of an unidentified probe, small, primitive, metal that had drifted past the boundary 14 years ago and been cataloged as a Terran deep space attempt. The probe had been moving at a fraction of the speed it would need to leave the star system. It had been going nowhere in particular. Very slowly. That was the most interesting thing in 30 years. Until now. He filed a sensor malfunction report. He was thorough about it. He described the anomalous readings in precise terms, noted that diagnostic checks had not resolved the issue, and recommended a maintenance review at the next rotation handoff. He transmitted it to the sector station and set it to autocopy to the regional command log. Then he sat back down in the command chair and watched the hole in the star field. It did not move. It did not do anything. It simply sat there at the edge of human space with the patience of something that had been waiting for a while and was comfortable waiting a while longer. Prextoon was not supposed to be on the Times Patience of Ren. He had been assigned there 6 weeks ago as part of a new initiative to embed intelligence analysts on border patrol vessels, because someone in the upper levels of Dominion intelligence had decided that real-time data analysis was preferable to the standard practice of collecting 4 months of sensor logs and reviewing them in an office 6 weeks after the fact. Prextoon had not been enthusiastic about the assignment. He was 26 years old and had spent 3 years building a career in archival analysis, specifically because archival analysis happened in offices. Warm, gravity-stable offices, not patrol frigates at the edge of nowhere. He had been making the best of it. He had a good chair. He had brought his own reference materials. He had established a routine. He was fine. He was reviewing a standard atmospheric composition report from the Terran planet. Their levels of a particular industrial gas had been rising steadily for 6 decades, which was exactly what you expected from a developing civilization. Not interesting. Just data, when Osprian made her sound. Prextoon looked up. He watched Relvan walk over to the sensor station. He watched the commander look at the screen. He watched him ask for the diagnostic to be run a 3rd time. He got up and walked over. The mass reading was still there. The occultation shadow was still there. The shape in the star field sat in front of him on the screen, and his analyst's brain immediately started reaching for the archive. "Can I see the energy signature?" he asked. Osprian looked at Relvan. Relvan nodded. She brought up the energy signature. Prextoon looked at it for a long time. He had a good memory for signatures. He had spent 3 years in archival analysis, cross-referencing drive signatures from survey contacts, logged anomalies, and unidentified objects. His brain was essentially a library of things that had appeared on sensors and what they turned out to be. He knew this signature. He knew the shape of it, the frequency pattern, the particular way the energy dispersed at the edges. He didn't know it from a current file. He knew it from an old one, a very old one. "Give me access to the contact archive," he said. His voice was doing something he didn't want it to do. He kept it level. Full archive, starting from 80 years ago. Osprian gave him access. He went into the archive and he found the file from the original Terran survey. He found the energy readings from the planet's nuclear facilities, early and primitive, logged and catalogued. He found the propulsion signature from the space probes they had sent out during that period. Small, faint, the power output of something that hadn't yet figured out how to leave its own solar system. He pulled that signature and put it on the screen next to the signature from the current anomaly. They were the same. The shape was identical. The frequency pattern matched. The dispersal profile at the edges was the same curve, the same physics, the same underlying principle. Human nuclear propulsion. Except, he ran the scale comparison, except the output differential was 412 times larger. He ran it again. 412. He stared at the number. His brain tried to put it into the right category. It couldn't find the category. It kept returning an error. 412 times the output of a primitive Terran nuclear probe, but the same fundamental signature, which meant the same fundamental technology. Scaled up by, he looked at the occultation shadow. He looked at the mass reading. He looked back at the energy signature comparison. In the 80 years since the survey team filed their report and went home, humanity had taken the technology they had, the small, primitive, barely functional nuclear technology they had in the year of first contact, and they had scaled it. They had not abandoned it for something cleaner. They had not discovered a different principle. They had taken what they had, and they had built it larger and larger and larger, until whatever was sitting in the space in front of him now ran on the same physics as those old probes, the way a mountain runs on the same physics as a pebble. Relvan was reading over his shoulder. He had been silent for a while. "What are we looking at?" he said. Prextoon had been doing this long enough to know that the way you said something the first time mattered. Once a thing was named, it was real. The name lived in the logs. The name got transmitted to the station. The name went up the chain. He picked his words carefully. "This is an object of Terran origin," he said. "The drive signature matches the Terran nuclear propulsion profile from the first contact archive. The output differential suggests significant technological development since that survey. The mass and dimensional readings suggest the object is a vessel. A large one. Relvan looked at the occultation shadow on the screen, at the piece of the star field that wasn't there anymore. How large? He said. Prextoon pulled up the dimensional estimate from the mass reading. He looked at the number. He decided not to say it out loud. He turned the screen toward the commander instead and let him read it. Relvan read it. He was quiet for a moment. In kilometers, he said. Is that in kilometers? Yes. The commander looked at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at the occultation shadow. The shape of it. The patience of it. The way it just sat there in the dark and waited, blocking out the stars behind it. File a full contact report, he said finally. Priority 1. Full sensor data attached. I want it transmitted to Sector Command in the next 10 minutes. Yes, Commander. Relvan went back to the command chair. He sat down. He looked at the main screen where the hole in the star field held its position without moving. Has it made any signal? He asked. No, Osprian said. Nothing. No transmission. No active scan. No navigation beacon. It arrived, and it stopped. It's just sitting there. Yes. He thought about that. A vessel of that size, with that power output, sitting at the boundary of the Terran quarantine sector, without transmitting, without scanning, without making any signal at all. Just present. Just there. The thing that bothered him, the thing that he couldn't put into a report because it was not data, was the quality of that waiting. It didn't feel like an arrival. It felt like a resumption, like something that had always been there and had simply become visible. Like it had been doing this, being ready, being present, being enormous in the dark for a long time. He filed the report. At the regional sector station, the report from the Times Patients of Ren Times arrived in a queue of 47 other reports and sat there for 2 hours before anyone opened it. The duty officer who opened it read it once, read it again, and then spent several minutes looking at the sensor data attachment. She pulled up the Terran quarantine sector file from the main archive. She read the original survey report from 80 years ago. She read the assessment at the end, the one that said Times Class F, no threat, monitoring interval, 200 years. She looked at the mass reading from the Times Patients of Ren's Times sensor data. She flagged the report as priority escalation and sent it to the station commander's desk. Then she sat for a moment and thought about the monitoring interval. 200 years. They were 80 years in. In the remaining 120 years of that monitoring interval, something on that planet had built whatever was sitting at the boundary of its space. She thought about what it might look like from the other side, standing on that small wet planet, looking up at a sky where you knew because they had come, the survey team had come, and looked, and left you knew something was out there, something that had found you and categorized you and gone home. She thought about what she would do with 120 years of that knowledge. She was glad the report wasn't her problem to solve. She forwarded it and went back to her queue. Prextoon was still at the sensor station when the vessel finally did something. It had been 6 hours since its arrival. 6 hours of the Times, Patience of Ren, time sitting at its safe, observation distance, and watching the hole in the starfield. 6 hours of running scans, filing updates, waiting for a response from Sector Command that had not yet arrived. The crew had eaten a shift meal. Someone had slept. The anomaly had remained exactly where it was, exactly as it was, doing nothing. Then the lights changed. That was the only way to describe it. Along the visible surface of the object, the part of it that was catching the faint light of the distant Terran star, something changed. A shift in the way the surface absorbed and reflected light. Running lights came on. Navigation markers. Standard spacing for a vessel. Osprian pulled up the visual at maximum magnification. The hull surface was not smooth. It was layered. Plates over plates, thick ones, with gaps between them that implied interior systems of considerable depth. There were structures along the dorsal surface towers, arrays, things that stuck up and out in ways that suggested purpose without immediately declaring what that purpose was. There were recessed sections along the sides that were darker than the surrounding hull, set in regular patterns, uniformly spaced. Prextoon looked at those recessed sections for a while. He had done enough archival analysis to know what weapon ports looked like. He had seen the design philosophy of a dozen different spacefaring civilizations. The Dominion's own warships were elegant about it. Clean lines, Minimal external profile. You didn't advertise. The recessed sections were not hidden. They were not disguised. They were simply there. The way a building has windows. The way a road has lanes. Infrastructure. Obvious and unashamed. He started counting. He stopped counting because he needed to write something down first, and he didn't have anything to write with. Then his station received an incoming signal. The frequency was standard Dominion diplomatic hailing. The language was Keth Standard, the formal version, the version used in official communications between recognized parties. 11 words. Ambassador vessel detected. Please specify preferred rendezvous coordinates. The bridge went quiet. Prex-Tuan read the message a second time. He parsed every word of it. Ambassador vessel times. They had identified the times. Patience of Wren. Times not as a patrol frigate or a military contact, but as an ambassador vessel. Detected times they had known the frigate was there. For how long? Before the frigate detected them? Or after? Please specify times. The grammar was formal, but the please was real. An actual courtesy request. Not a formula. Preferred rendezvous coordinates. They were asking where the Dominion wanted to meet. They had been sitting there for 6 hours in the dark at the edge of their space, silent, waiting. And the first thing they said when they opened communication was a polite request for the Dominion's preference. Relvan read the message from the command chair. He read it again. He looked at Prex-Tuan. Prex-Tuan thought about the archive, about the survey report, about the monitoring interval, about 80 years, and a vessel 4 kilometers long that ran on scaled-up versions of technology that had existed at first contact. They hadn't built something new. They had built something more, bigger, stronger, redundant and layered and over-engineered in ways that the Dominion philosophy of measured escalation would have considered irrational. And they had been waiting, politely, at the edge of their own space, not crossing the boundary, not scanning aggressively, not making demands, just being visible and enormous and patient and asking, when they finally spoke, where the Dominion would like to meet. He thought about the note he was going to have to add to his report, the part where he tried to explain what 80 years of looking at a sky full of unknowns had apparently produced. He opened his log. He typed one line. We forgot to check what they were afraid of. Outside the viewport, the vessel sat in the dark with its lights on, waiting for an answer. The stars behind it were still gone. The report from the Times Patience of Wren Times reached the High Council's logistics desk on a Wednesday morning, which was unfortunate, because Wednesday mornings were reserved for the quarterly trade route review, and the trade route review had been scheduled for 3 months, and 16 senior officials had arranged their schedules around it. The logistics officer who received the report read it twice. She looked at the sensor data. She looked at the mass reading. She looked at the energy signature comparison that the young analyst had attached, the one showing the Terran nuclear propulsion profile from 80 years ago, sitting next to the current reading, like a child's drawing placed beside the building. It grew up to become. She forwarded it to the duty admiral with a note that said, "Recommend review before trade meeting." The duty admiral read it during the first break in the trade meeting. He did not return to the trade meeting. By the time the sun set on the Dominion's central world that Wednesday, 4 separate departments had the report on their desks, and 3 separate departments were pretending they didn't. The 4th department, Frontier Intelligence, was the one that actually did something. They pulled the full Terran sector archive. They assigned a review team. They sent an encrypted priority message to Admiral Veth Saran, who was the senior fleet commander for the Outer Western Territories and who was known, among those who worked with him, for being the kind of officer who did not panic and did not delay and did not use language loosely. The message said, "Anomalous contact at Terran boundary. Verification sweep required. Your discretion on force composition." Veth Saran received the message, read the attached report, looked at the sensor data, and spent 45 minutes in his office without communicating with anyone. Then he authorized a verification fleet, 5 vessels. The Times' long consideration, which was his own command ship, plus 4 escort frigates. Standard diplomatic configuration, enough presence to be taken seriously, not enough to be read as aggression. He wrote the order with the precise, unhurried handwriting of a man who had decided something and was done deciding it. He did not write anywhere in the order what he actually thought. That was not what orders were for. The verification fleet arrived at the Terran boundary in 6 days. Prextoon was on the times long consideration times when they dropped out of FTL, because the sector station commander had decided that the analyst who found the anomaly should be present for the follow-up. Prextoon had not been consulted on this decision. He had simply been transferred, with his chair and his reference materials, and the growing sense that his career had taken a turn he had not planned for. The Times, Patience of Ren Times, was still at its observation post. It had maintained position for 6 days. It had continued to file hourly status reports. Every report said the same thing. Object holding position. No aggressive action. No movement. No further communication. To aggress. After the first hailing message, 11 words asking for preferred rendezvous coordinates, the vessel at the boundary had said nothing else. It had just waited. Veth Saran reviewed the Times. Patience of Ren's Times. 6 days of status reports. In the time it took the Times, long consideration times to complete its arrival maneuver. Then he stood at the forward viewport and looked at the object for the first time. He had read every number in every report. He had processed the mass reading and the energy signature and the dimensional estimate. He had done it methodically, the way he did everything, building a picture in his mind from data so that the visual confirmation would not be a surprise. He was surprised anyway. The numbers had been correct. The numbers were always correct. But numbers describing a thing and the thing itself were not the same experience, and the thing itself was sitting in the space ahead of them, and it was very large, and it was not moving, and it was the product of a civilization that had been filed under times, eventual absorption, candidates, times, and forgotten. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned to his sensor chief and said, "Full sweep, everything." The sweep took 4 hours. Prextoon sat at his assigned station on the Times Long Considerations Times Intelligence deck and watched the data come in. Around him, 6 other analysts were doing the same thing. Nobody was talking much. The data kept arriving and people kept looking at it and not talking. The hull was layered. That was the first thing the sweep established clearly. Not a single shell of material between the interior and space, the way most vessels were built, but multiple layers, plates, laid over plates, each one thick enough to be the entire hull of a standard patrol frigate, with visible gaps between them that suggested shock absorption architecture, the kind of design you used when you expected the outer layers to be destroyed and wanted the inner ones to still function. The sweep found 8 distinct drive systems, 8 separate propulsion methods, each one using a different underlying physical principle, all of them running simultaneously at low output. The Dominion built redundant systems. Every critical system had a backup, but 8 independent drives on a single vessel was not redundancy. Redundancy was a spare. 8 was a philosophy. The sweep found the weapon emplacements. Prextoon had started counting them the night the vessel appeared. He had stopped and started again several times. The final count from the sweep was not a number he wrote in his primary report. He wrote it in his secondary report, the one flagged for senior command eyes only. The number was large enough that writing it in a document that might be broadly distributed felt irresponsible. Not because it was secret, but because it was the kind of number that changed the way people thought about things, and some people needed to be prepared before they encountered it. There were also the crew figures. A Dominion vessel of comparable size and comparable was a word being used very loosely here, because nothing in the Dominion fleet was truly comparable in scale, would carry approximately 300 crew. The life sign sweep of the Terran vessel returned a count just under 6,000. 6,000. The analyst running the life sign sweep ran it twice. Then she looked at Prextoon across the deck. He nodded. She entered the number into her report without saying anything out loud, which was the right decision. Veth Saran read the sweep results in his private office with his door closed. He was a man who processed information in order. He read from the top of the document to the bottom, in sequence, without skipping ahead. He had done this for 30 years, and it served him well. You understood things better when you encountered them in the order the person writing the report intended. He read about the layered hull. He read about the 8 drive systems. He read the weapon count. He stopped there. He went back and read the sentence before it, which confirmed the methodology of the count, to make sure it was right. It was right. He read the number again. He moved on. He read about the crew of 6,000. He read Prextoon's supplemental note at the end of the sweep summary, which said, "Drive signature consistent with Terran nuclear propulsion principles." Output differential from first contact baseline, 412 times. No evidence of technology acquisition from external source. Development appears to be internal and continuous over 80-year period. Internal and continuous. They had not traded for this. They had not discovered a shortcut. They had taken the technology they had primitive, early, barely adequate for leaving their own atmosphere, and they had worked on it for 80 years, continuously. Veth Saran thought about the Dominion's doctrine of measured escalation. You built what you needed. You spent the minimum force for the required outcome. Waste was considered not just inefficient but philosophically wrong, a failure of judgment, a sign of fear or overreaction. A civilization's military architecture was a direct expression of its values. And Dominion values said, you built clean, you built minimal, you built exactly what the situation required and nothing more. He looked at the sweep data for the Terran vessel. Whatever values had produced this vessel, they were not those values. He called Prextuan to his office. The analyst arrived looking like someone who had not slept and was not planning to. Veth Saran gestured to a chair. Prextuan sat in it. The original survey report, Veth Saran said. You've read it. Yes, Admiral. The assessment. The conclusion. Class F. No threat. Monitoring interval. 200 years. Yes. Based on what you've observed in the past 6 days, the original contact and this sweep, what is your professional assessment of that conclusion? Prextuan was quiet for a moment. The conclusion was accurate for the data available at the time of the survey, he said. The survey team observed a civilization with nuclear capability, early space probes, and no FTL technology. The conclusion that they posed no threat to the Dominion was correct, given those facts. 1. But the conclusion didn't account for trajectory, Prextuan said. It assessed where they were, not where they were going, and it didn't account for motivation. We cataloged their capability. We didn't ask what would happen to that capability if they were given a reason to develop it very quickly. 2. Veth Saran looked at him. And what was their reason? Us, Prextuan said. The survey. We came, we looked, we left. They knew we existed. They knew we were more advanced. They had no idea if we were coming back or what we would do when we did. He paused. 80 years is not a long time for a civilization, but it is enough time if the motivation is strong enough. The Admiral was quiet. I have a note in my personal log, Prextuan said. From the night of the first contact, I wrote, we forgot to check what they were afraid of. I think that is the accurate summary of the survey's analytical failure. Veth Saran did not respond to that directly. He looked at the sweep data on his desk. At the layered hull, the 8 drives, the weapon count, he was not going to repeat out loud in this conversation or any other until he had decided how to handle it. The vessel has not moved, he said. It has not scanned us aggressively. It sent one communication 6 days ago requesting our preference for rendezvous coordinates, and has said nothing since. Yes, Admiral, it is waiting. Yes, for us to answer. I believe so. Veth Saran stood up. He walked to his viewport. The Terran vessel was visible from here, distant but present, its running lights steady in the dark. It had the quality of something that was very comfortable being still, patient in a way that was not passive, more like a thing that had done everything it needed to do and was simply waiting for the rest of the situation to catch up. The 6,000 crew members, he said. I want your analysis on that. Prextuan had expected this question. A vessel this size, optimally crewed by Dominion standards, requires approximately 300. The Terran complement is 20 times that. The excess crew cannot be explained by operational requirements. It can only be explained by damage tolerance planning. Explain. They built the ship expecting it to take severe damage. The excess crew exists so that when significant sections of the vessel are destroyed, or on fire, or otherwise non-functional, enough people remain to keep the rest of it running. He paused again. They built for the scenario where a large part of their crew is dead and the ship still needs to fight. The viewport framed the vessel in the middle distance. Its lights were steady. The stars behind it were still gone. They built for worst cases, Veth Saran said. They built for every case they could imagine, Prextuan said. And then some they probably couldn't. The redundancy in this vessel is not engineering. It is psychology. It is the physical expression of a civilization that decided it would not be caught without options. The Admiral turned from the viewport. He went back to his desk and sat down. He opened the communication panel and found the channel Osprian had logged on the times Patience of Ren times the one the Terran vessel had used 6 days ago when it sent its 11 words. He drafted a reply. It took him several attempts. The first draft was too formal and read like a legal notice. The second was too brief and felt dismissive given the circumstances. The third was too long and said too much about Dominion intentions before those intentions had been properly authorized by the relevant council bodies. The fourth draft said, "Contact acknowledged. Senior command presence now on station, requesting direct communication with vessel commander at your convenience." He read it once more. "At your convenience." Quote. He left that in. It felt right. It acknowledged, without stating it plainly, that the situation had shifted, that the Dominion was no longer the party setting terms by default. He sent it. The reply came back in 4 minutes. Admiral Vethsaran. This is Captain Yusra Okafor of the UHNS Unrelenting. We are prepared to receive you aboard at any time you wish. We have guest accommodations ready. We look forward to the conversation. The Admiral read it twice. We have guest accommodations ready. They had prepared for guests. They had known a senior Dominion official would come eventually, and they had prepared a place for that official to stay. We look forward to the conversation, not the meeting, not the negotiation, not the assessment or the summit, or the formal exchange of diplomatic credentials. The conversation, like this, was something they had been wanting to have for a while and were glad it was finally happening. He turned to Prextoon. "Pack what you need," he said. "You're coming with me." Prextoon looked at him. "You found it," the Admiral said. "You should see the rest of it." That night, in the quiet of the Times Long Considerations Times Intelligence deck, Prextoon pulled up the Terran open-source communication archive. He had access to 80 years of signals the planet had broadcast: their news, their entertainment, their government communications, their scientific publications. All of it had been collected automatically by the sector monitoring systems and stored without review. He searched for references to the Dominion, to First Contact, to the survey team that had come and gone. He found them in the first 10 minutes. Public records, official government announcements, news reports accessible to any citizen of the planet who wanted to read them. The survey had not been a secret on their end. They had known exactly what had happened. He read through 80 years of their public response to knowing that something larger and more advanced than them existed and had found them, and left without explaining why. He read policy papers, defense proposals, scientific arguments, public debates. He read the legislation that had funded their early FTL research. He read the Shipyard Commission reports. He read the speeches given by officials at the launch ceremonies for the first vessels in their fleet. It had all been public, all of it, available to anyone who looked. Nobody had looked. He added a second line to his personal log. They were not hiding. We were not watching. Outside, the Times Unrelenting Times held its position with its lights on and waited for morning. The shuttle from the Times Long Consideration Times crossed the distance between the two vessels in 20 minutes. Vethsaran sat in the forward seat and watched the Times Unrelenting Times grow in the viewport the whole way. That was a deliberate choice. He wanted to look at it without the mediation of a sensor screen, without numbers and readings between him and the reality of the thing. He wanted his eyes to do the work and report back honestly. His eyes reported back that the sensor data had been accurate, and that accurate data was not the same as being prepared. The vessel filled the viewport before they were halfway there. Then it filled more than the viewport. Then the viewport could only show a section of it at a time, and he had to mentally assemble the sections into a whole, the way you reconstruct a large painting from photographs. The hull surface up close was not smooth steel. It was a geography, ridges and recesses and layered plates and structural channels running in parallel lines across the surface, like the grain of something that had grown rather than been built. Running lights were spaced along it at regular intervals, steady and white, and they were very far apart from each other, which told you something about the distances involved. The shuttle bay was large enough to hold 6 Dominion frigates. They landed in one corner of it. Captain Yusra Okafor was waiting at the bottom of the landing ramp. She was not what Vethsaran had built in his mind during the 6 days since her message arrived. He had constructed a type, the senior military commander of a vessel this size, on a mission this significant, representing a civilization that had spent 80 years preparing for this moment. His mind had produced something formidable looking, something that announced itself. She was of medium height. She was wearing the dark uniform of her service with no decoration beyond her rank insignia and a small pin on her left lapel that he would later learn was her ship's crest. Her hair was close cut and her posture was straight without being rigid. She had the face of someone who slept well and had made peace with most things. She looked at him the way you look at someone you have been expecting for a long time. "Admiral Vethsaran," she said. Her Keth standard was precise and unaccented. "Welcome aboard the Times Unrelenting. I'm glad you came. Not Times glad you could come. Glad you came." The difference was small and mattered entirely. "Captain Okafor," he said. "Thank you for the invitation. I thought a tour might be useful," she said, "before we talk. So you can see what we made." He noticed the word, made. Not Times built Times or Times developed Times, or Times constructed. Made. The way you say it about something personal. Something that came from you. "I would like that," he said. She took him through the forward sections first. The corridors of the Times Unrelenting Times were wider than Dominion standard. Vethsaran noticed it immediately and filed it without comment. Dominion corridors were sized for efficient movement. These were sized for movement while carrying something large, or moving in a group, or navigating when sections of the wall had collapsed inward. They were built for degraded conditions. The overhead was higher than necessary. The lighting had multiple independent sources in every section, so that no single failure could darken a passage completely. Prextoon was walking 2 paces behind the Admiral, quiet, watching everything. He had brought a data pad. He was not writing on it. He was just holding it, which Vethsaran understood. Sometimes you hold something familiar because everything else in your environment is unfamiliar. They passed a damage control station built into the corridor wall. It was not tucked away. It was not behind a panel or down a side passage. It was right there, at eye level, labeled clearly, fully stocked, accessible in seconds. Vethsaran slowed down as they passed it. "Damage control access points," Okafor said, reading the pause. "We have one every 40 meters throughout the ship." "That is a significant number," he said carefully. "Yes," she said. "We wanted anyone, anywhere on this ship, to be able to respond to a fire or a hull breach without having to go looking for equipment." She said it without particular emphasis. A design choice, a reasonable one given the goals. He thought about the goals it implied. They walked on. She took him to the armor sections next. There was a viewing corridor, a passage that ran alongside a cross-section of the hull structure so you could see the layers. Someone had built it specifically for this purpose. He wondered, as he stood in front of the transparent panel looking at what the hull was made of, whether they had built this corridor for visitors or for their own crew, whether they walked their own people through here to show them what was between them and space. The layers were visible from inside out. Each one was thick. Between each pair of layers was a gap-structured space with what looked like shock-absorbing architecture, designed to let the outer layers absorb and dissipate impact energy before it reached the next one. The innermost layer was different from the rest. Darker, denser. "How many layers?" Vethsaran asked. 9, Okafor said. He looked at the cross-section. A Dominion warship of serious classification had 2 layers and an ablative coating. 2 layers was considered sufficient. 2 layers plus coating was considered thorough. "The outer layers," he said. "They are designed to be destroyed." "Yes," she said. "The outer 3 are sacrificial. They absorb the strike. The middle layers manage the energy. The inner layers protect the crew and critical systems." She paused. "We want the ship to still function after taking damage that would destroy a single hull vessel completely. So we built for that." "This adds considerable mass," he said. "Yes, and reduces speed and maneuverability." "Yes." He waited for her to explain why that trade-off was acceptable. She didn't. She just looked at the hull cross-section with him, as if the answer was visible in the layers themselves if you looked long enough. He decided not to push it. He looked at the layers. He thought about what kind of damage you were expecting when you built 9 of them. They walked on. The engine room was a separate building inside the ship. That was the only way to think about it. It occupied a volume in the aft section of the vessel that would have comfortably contained the entire times patience of Ren times with room left over. The ceiling was high enough that the upper workings were in a different atmospheric zone. The noise was managed but present a deep, layered vibration that came from multiple sources at once, each one slightly different, overlapping into something that was less a sound than a physical condition of the air. The 8 drive systems were arranged in a configuration Veth-Saran could not immediately parse. They were not in a line. They were not symmetrically placed. They were positioned according to some logic he didn't have the framework for. Why this arrangement? He said. So that if any section of the ship is damaged and we lose access to certain drives, we still have redundant thrust in every direction, Okafor said. No configuration of damage leaves us with only forward thrust, or only one axis of movement. He looked at the arrangement again, saw it now. It was not aesthetic. It was a solution to a problem, the problem of what happens when parts of the ship are gone. The drives were positioned so that the ship could maneuver, even when it was significantly destroyed. Each system uses a different physical principle, Prex-Tuin said quietly from behind them. He had apparently been doing math on his datapad after all. If one principle is disrupted by a weapon designed to counter it, for example, the others continue to function. F. 2. F. Okafor looked at him. Something moved across her expression briefly. Not surprise. More like the satisfaction of being understood. Yes, she said. Exactly. Veth-Saran thought about the doctrine of measured escalation. About building precisely what you needed. About the philosophical principle that excess was a failure of judgment. He thought about the 8 drives running simultaneously, each on different physics, positioned to maintain function through catastrophic damage scenarios. He had been applying the wrong framework. This was not excess. This was thoroughness. The Dominion built for the expected case. Humanity had built for every case, including the ones they hoped would never happen, and they had built for those cases with the same seriousness they brought to the expected ones. He walked through the engine room and did not say what he was thinking. She showed him the medical bay. It was large. This alone was not surprising. A crew of 6,000 needed significant medical capacity. What was notable was the configuration. The beds were not arranged in rows in a single room. They were distributed in clusters throughout the section, each cluster its own sealed unit with its own power supply and its own air system. Compartmentalization, she said. If a strike hits the medical section, we don't lose all of it. Each cluster can function independently. The idea is that if the forward medical cluster is destroyed, the aft ones are still treating the wounded from the forward section. Veth-Saran looked at the nearest cluster, at the sealed doors and the independent power feeds, and the redundant air supply, at the efficiency with which the space was used, every centimeter serving a purpose. He thought about the kind of battle you planned for when you designed your medical bay around the assumption that a significant portion of it would be destroyed. He said nothing. They walked on. The weapons deck was the last stop before the bridge. She walked him through it at a steady pace. She did not linger. She did not slow down for dramatic effect or attempt to impress. She pointed things out the way a person points out features of a house they have lived in long enough that the features are just facts. The emplacements were not identical. This was the first thing he noticed. Different types, different sizes, different configurations. Dominion weapons philosophy was standardization. You picked the most effective system, and you deployed it uniformly. Easier to maintain, easier to crew, cleaner in action. These were not that. You have multiple weapon types, he said. Yes. Different systems for different scenarios, different ranges, different target types, different effects. She paused briefly. We wanted to be able to respond to things we hadn't encountered yet. If we only brought one type of weapon and it turned out to be ineffective against a particular target, we wanted options. Things we hadn't encountered yet. He was building up a list of phrases from this tour that he was going to think about for a long time afterward. That one went on the list. He counted the emplacements as they walked. He counted more than the sweep had found, because the sweep had missed the internal configurations, weapon systems that could be brought to bear through sections of the hull that looked, from outside, like plain armor plating. He stopped counting at a number he was not going to write in a report that left his hands. He stopped counting and he walked, and he kept his face the way he had trained it, still, composed, professionally neutral, and he thought about what he was going to tell the High Council. She took him to the bridge last. It was large and calm. The crew at their stations worked with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this long enough that it required no visible effort. Several of them looked up when the Admiral entered, and then returned to their work with expressions that were respectful, but not awed, which told him something about the confidence of the crew, or about how long they had been prepared for this day, or both. The main screen showed the view of the surrounding space. The times, long consideration times, and her 4 escorts were visible at their observation distance. They looked, from this perspective, small. Okafor stood with him at the forward viewport for a moment. "You've seen most of it," she said. "You have questions." "Many," he said. She waited. He thought about what to ask first. There were tactical questions and strategic questions and diplomatic questions, and they would all be asked in due time and in proper settings. But there was one question that was not tactical, or strategic, or diplomatic. It was the question that had been forming since the moment he stood in the viewing corridor looking at 9 layers of armor and understood that they were designed to be destroyed. He asked it the way it formed, directly. "Captain Okafor, this ship, the design philosophy behind it, the redundancy, the over-engineering, the excess crew, the 9 hull layers, the 8 drives, the multiple weapon types, everything I have seen today points to the same thing. You built this expecting the worst. Every system on this vessel is a contingency for a scenario you hoped would never happen." He looked at her. "What were you expecting?" She was quiet for a moment. The bridge crew worked around them. The screens showed the stars. "When the survey team came," she said, 80 years ago they came to our system. They observed us. They catalogued us. Then they left. They gave us no explanation, no communication, no indication of intent." She was not looking at him. She was looking at the main screen, at the stars and the distant shapes of his ships. "We knew you existed. We knew you were more advanced than us. We knew you had found us and assessed us and gone home. We didn't know why." She looked at him then. "That was it," she said. "That's what drove all of this. Not a specific threat, not intelligence about your intentions. Just that. The not knowing. The possibility that the next time someone came, they might not come to observe." He held her gaze. "Every piece of this ship," she said, "is an answer to the question of what to do when you don't know why." The bridge was quiet except for the soft sounds of work. Vethsaran stood with the viewport behind him and the Terran captain in front of him, and he thought about the survey team. About the report they filed. About the tidy conclusion at the end of it and the 200-year monitoring interval, and the way the file had settled into the archive and stayed there. He thought about what it looked like from the other side. From the surface of a small, wet planet, watching a ship appear in your sky and do its work, and disappear without a word. He thought about 4 words. We didn't know why. He had come here to determine whether humanity was a threat. He was beginning to understand that he had been asking the wrong question entirely. That evening, in the guest quarters aboard the Times Unrelenting, Vethsaran opened his log and began his preliminary report to the High Council. He wrote for a long time. He described the hull and the drives in the medical bay and the weapons deck. He described the tour in sequence, methodically, the way he did everything. Then he got to the assessment section. He stared at it for a while. He had written assessments for 30 years. He had a framework for them. Threat classification, capability summary, recommended response. Clean, useful, actionable. He started typing. He deleted the word times threat times after he typed it. Then he typed it again. Then he deleted it again. He replaced it with times contact. Then he deleted times contact times and looked at the blank space and thought about what word actually fit what he had seen today. He settled, in the end, on a phrase he had never used in a report before, because he had never encountered a situation that required it. Category requires revision. He saved the document and set it to transmit in the morning. Outside his viewport, the Times, Unrelenting Times, hummed with the quiet of 6,000 people at rest. The stars were visible from here, the ones that weren't blocked by the hull sections curving around the guest quarters like walls of a canyon made of steel. He thought about 9 layers of armor, each one designed to be destroyed in sequence so the last layer could survive. He thought about a civilization that had built all of that, from fear of a question they couldn't answer. He thought that if he had been in their position, if someone had come to his world and looked and left without a word, he might have done exactly the same thing. He turned off the light and sat in the dark for a while before he slept. Veth Saran's report arrived at the High Council chamber on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the quarterly trade route review had been cancelled for the second time in 2 weeks. The officials who had arranged their schedules around it were not told why. They were told it had been postponed. They accepted this because senior officials in the Dominion were accustomed to things being postponed without explanation, and because the particular tone of the administrative message that informed them, dry, brief, no rescheduled date offered, suggested that asking for one would be unproductive. The High Council met in closed session. There were 9 of them. They had between them 411 years of combined governance experience. They had managed wars, famines, diplomatic collapses, the absorption of 37 new species into the Dominion, and one incident involving a rogue artificial intelligence that was still technically classified and would remain so for another 200 years. They were not easily unsettled. They read Veth Saran's report in silence. The session lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, they had produced one resolution, which instructed the military command to conduct a full threat assessment, and one private consensus, which was never written down anywhere, which was that the trade route review was probably going to stay cancelled for a while. Military command received the instruction on Friday morning. The general assigned to lead the threat assessment was a Keth male named Dros Var, who had served for 40 years and who approached problems the way a surgeon approaches a body, with the assumption that, if you looked carefully enough and knew your tools, you would find the answer. He assembled a team. He gave them the sensor data, the sweep results, Veth Saran's report, and the full Terran sector archive. Then he asked them to run a wargame simulation. The wargame was standard procedure. You took the contact vessel, you took an equivalent Dominion force, you ran the scenario through the tactical modeling system, and the system told you how it ended. The Dominion had done this for every significant military contact in the past 2 centuries. The results were used to calibrate response protocols. The first simulation ran for 40 minutes. It ended badly. Drosvar looked at the result. He adjusted the variables. He gave the Dominion force better positioning, better initial conditions, a first strike advantage. He ran it again. It ended badly differently. He ran it a 3rd time with the maximum allowable Dominion force composition, a configuration that had never actually been assembled in practice because it represented a mobilization scale normally reserved for existential conflicts. It ended badly in a 3rd way. He sat with the 3 results for a long time. Then he called his senior tactician in and showed them the results without comment, the way you show someone a thing and wait to see what they say about it. His senior tactician looked at the 3 results for a long time. The armor, she said, finally. Yes, our standard weapon systems are optimized against single hull and double hull targets. Against 9 layers with this kind of shock absorption architecture, the energy delivery to the interior is... She stopped. We would need to revise our weapons entirely to penetrate this efficiently. The drives, he said. 8 independent systems on different physical principles. You cannot disable their propulsion with a single disruption method. You would need to suppress 8 separate drive types simultaneously, which means 8 separate weapon systems deployed in coordination, which means... She stopped again. The crew count, he said. She looked at the result of the 3rd simulation. Even with catastrophic damage to 70% of the vessel, the remaining crew count is sufficient to maintain all critical systems and continue combat operations. She was quiet. They built it to keep fighting when most of it is gone. Drosvar nodded. File it, he said. Full classification. Admiral General Eyes only. She filed it. He ran the simulation 4 more times, because he was thorough, and because he wanted to be wrong. The simulation continued to be consistent. He wrote the assessment summary. He used careful language. He described capabilities and countermeasures and tactical parameters and response considerations. He was a professional, and the document reflected that. At the bottom, in the recommendations section, he wrote one line that was not careful at all, because sometimes honesty was more useful than care. Recommend that engagement be pursued only as an absolute last resort and not before significant revision of current weapons doctrine. 2. He submitted it and went home early for the first time in 11 years. Intelligence Division had the Terran Sector Archive. They had always had it. 80 years of automated monitoring, signals collection, atmospheric readings, population data, and open-source communication intercepts, collected continuously by unmanned systems and stored in a sector data vault without review. The vault was large. The data filled it. Nobody had opened it in a serious analytical capacity since the original survey. The division chief assigned a team of 12 on Friday afternoon. She gave them 72 hours and told them she wanted a comprehensive summary covering the full 80-year period, with emphasis on military development, technological progress, and anything that spoke to the civilization's strategic intent. The team went to work. At the 40-hour mark, the team lead, a senior analyst named Voss Kreen, who had been with Intelligence Division for 15 years and who had a reputation for being hard to rattle, requested an urgent meeting with the division chief. The chief was in a budget review. She sent back a message saying she would be available in 2 hours. Voss Kreen replied that 2 hours was fine and went back to work. When the chief arrived, Voss Kreen pulled up 3 documents on the briefing screen. The first was a public Terran government record from 63 years ago, a legislative proposal for the establishment of what the humans called a Deep Space Defense Initiative. It outlined a long-term program to develop faster-than-light travel, build a standing military fleet, and establish a permanent presence at the boundary of their solar system. The document was publicly accessible. It had been posted on the Terran government's official communication network. It cited the survey visit as the direct motivation. This was public, the chief said. Publicly posted, Voss Kreen said. Accessible to any citizen of the planet. And to us, if anyone had looked at the archive. The second document was from 50 years ago. A progress report on the Deep Space Defense Initiative, also publicly posted, outlining the completion of their first experimental FTL drive and the projected timeline for fleet construction. The projected timeline was ambitious. Aggressively ambitious. They had met every milestone. The third document was from 14 years ago. It was the commissioning record for a vessel called the Times Unrelenting, the first of what the humans designated their Bulwark-class heavy defense ships. It described the vessel's specifications in considerable detail. Hull configuration, drive systems, crew complement, weapon loadout. All of it, public, available. 1. The chief looked at the 3 documents on the screen. She looked at the Terran Archive Index, which showed 60 years of similar records, all of them filed and unread in the sector data vault. They weren't hiding any of this, she said. No, Voss Kreen said. They published it. Their entire development program, from proposal to completion, is documented in public records available through their government communication network. The assumption from their side appears to have been that we were watching. The chief was quiet. We were collecting, Voss Kreen said. The monitoring systems ran automatically. Everything came in and went into the vault, but nobody was reading it. For 80 years. For 80 years. The chief sat down. She looked at the archive index for a while, at the volume of data that had been sitting in storage, unread, while the civilization it documented built ships and published timetables, and worked through every milestone on a program they had launched in direct response to being visited, and left without explanation. How many vessels are currently registered in their fleet? She said. Voss Kreen pulled up the current Terran fleet manifest. It was, like everything else, publicly posted. 7 commissioned and active, she said. 3 under construction, with projected commissioning dates in the next 4 years. All Bulwark class. The chief looked at the manifest. Is the Times Unrelenting Times the most advanced? She said. Their newest. Voss Kreen looked at the manifest. She looked at the commissioning dates. No, she said. The Times, Unrelenting Times, was commissioned 14 years ago. It is the oldest active vessel in the fleet. The 6 others were commissioned between 6 and 2 years ago. They incorporate technological improvements over the original design. The chief was quiet for a long moment. The Times, Unrelenting Times, is the oldest, she said. Yes. The chief took 3 days of medical leave starting Saturday morning. She submitted the team's full report before she left. The report was thorough and well-organized and said everything that needed to be said in precise, measured language. Her personal note attached to the transmittal said only, "Archive review, strongly recommended as a standing operational priority going forward." The diplomatic corps met on Saturday to address the question of classification. The question was straightforward in theory. Every civilization in contact with the Dominion was assigned a class that indicated their level of development and their relationship to Dominion interests. Class F was the lowest primitive, no spacefaring capacity, no threat, minimal diplomatic priority. Class A was theoretical. It had been defined but never applied. It was the category for a civilization that could pose a genuine existential challenge to the Dominion itself. In 80 years, humanity had moved from Class F. The question was where they now sat. The debate lasted 9 hours. People who had spent their careers in diplomatic classification and who were very good at making careful distinctions and drawing precise lines found themselves in difficulty. The capabilities described in Veth Saran's report and the military command assessment did not fit neatly anywhere in the existing framework. The framework had been built around civilizations that developed along predictable paths at predictable rates. It had not been built around the scenario of a civilization with strong motivation and 80 years of focus. Someone suggested Class C. There was discussion. Someone suggested Class B. There was more discussion. Someone in the 6th hour said quietly that if they were applying the definitions as written, the honest answer was Class A. The room went silent. It was not the silence of disagreement. It was the silence of people who had reached the same conclusion independently and had been hoping someone else would say it first. Class A, the theoretical category, the one that existed in the framework, as a placeholder for something they had always assumed they would never actually encounter, because the Dominion was 4,000 years old and had never met anything that qualified and had therefore, gradually, and without formal decision, come to assume it never would. One of the senior diplomats said, carefully, that assigning Class A would require council approval and a full review of the diplomatic framework as it applied to the Terran contact. Another said that was correct. A third said that perhaps, given the circumstances, they should table the classification question and focus instead on the practical matter of what the diplomatic posture should be. This was agreed upon with considerable relief. The meeting produced a recommendation that a full diplomatic delegation be dispatched to Earth for formal talks. The delegation would be the largest the Dominion had ever assembled for an initial contact. The recommendation did not explain why. The people reading it would understand. Prex Toon submitted his own supplemental report on Saturday evening, still aboard the Times, unrelenting, still occupying the analyst's station they had given him on the intelligence deck. The report was 3 pages. The first 2 pages covered the open-source archive discovery, the publicly posted development records, the fleet manifest, the commissioning documents. He wrote it clearly and without editorializing, because a supplemental report was not the place for editorializing. The 3rd page was a short section he titled, Times Analytical Failure Review. He wrote that the primary failure of the original survey assessment was not the data collected, but the question asked. The survey team had asked, what is this civilization capable of now? The correct question, for any developing civilization with awareness of the Dominion's existence, was, what will this civilization be capable of if it has reason to develop quickly? He wrote that the secondary failure was the assumption of opacity, the assumption that a civilization being monitored would attempt to conceal its development. Humanity had not concealed anything. They had published everything. The opacity was on the Dominion side, created by an archive that collected without being read. He wrote one more paragraph at the end. It is worth noting that in every public document reviewed from the Terran archive, the stated purpose of the defense initiative is defensive. The program was not framed, in any public communication over 80 years, as preparation for expansion or aggression. It was framed, consistently, as preparation for the possibility of being threatened. The distinction is significant. A civilization that spends 80 years building the capacity to defend itself is not necessarily a civilization that intends to attack. It is, however, a civilization that intends to survive. He submitted the report. Then he went to the small common area on the deck and got something to eat and sat by the viewport for a while. The stars were visible from this angle, the real ones, not the ones blocked by the hull. The Terran star was a yellow point among them, warm-looking, from here. He thought about what it was like to stand on the planet around that star and know that something was out there, and not know what it wanted. He thought about what you would do with that knowledge if you had enough years and enough determination. He looked at the corridor outside the common area wide enough for emergency transit, lit from multiple independent sources, a damage control station visible at the junction 40 meters away. He thought. Of course they did. On Sunday, the High Council met again. Veth Saran's report had been joined by the Military Command Assessment, the Intelligence Division Archive Review, and the Diplomatic Corps Recommendation. The Council read all 4 documents over the course of the morning. In the afternoon session, the Council Chair asked for a motion on the diplomatic delegation proposal. One of the Council members moved that they send a delegation to Earth for formal talks, with the objective of establishing the terms of a mutual recognition treaty. There was a second. Before the vote, the Council member who had seconded the motion asked, because she was the kind of person who asked the questions that made everyone else uncomfortable, what the delegation's primary objective should be beyond the formal treaty language. The room was quiet. The Council Chair, who was 412 years old and had governed through more crises than anyone else in the room, and who had read all 4 reports that morning with the attention they deserved, said something that would later appear in the historical record of the session, and that Dominion political science students would be required to analyze for the next 500 years. She said, "We should like to discuss the terms under which humanity does not consider us a threat." The vote was unanimous. The delegation was authorized. The trade route review was officially canceled for the remainder of the quarter. Outside, across the dark distance of the sector boundary, the Times, unrelenting Times, held its position with its lights on, and its 6,000 crew members going about their work, patient, ready, waiting for the conversation that had been coming for 80 years to finally begin. The Dominion diplomatic delegation arrived at Earth on a Tuesday. There were 43 of them, senior diplomats, military attaches, trade specialists, legal advisors, cultural liaisons, 2 intelligence observers who were listed on the manifest as administrative staff, and 1 analyst named Prex Tuan, who had been included because Veth Saran had decided that the person who found the contact should see it through to the end. It was the largest first contact delegation the Dominion had ever assembled. The previous record had been 19 people, sent to the Velhari homeworld 300 years ago, when the Velhari had developed FTL travel and knocked on the Dominion's border, asking to join. The Velhari had been eager and formal, and had prepared an elaborate ceremony. Earth was not that. The shuttle descended through a blue atmosphere over a large landmass, and landed at a facility that was clean and functional and unremarkable, in the way of places built for practical use, rather than impression. There was no ceremony. There were people waiting on the landing platform, ground crew, a few officials, a security detail standing at a respectful distance. Veth Saran was the first down the ramp. Captain Okafor was standing at the bottom of it. She was in the same dark uniform she had worn aboard the Times Unrelenting, with the same small pin on her lapel. She looked exactly as she had looked 2 weeks ago, which meant she looked like someone who had been expecting this and was not surprised it had arrived. "Admiral," she said. "Captain," he said. "It's good to see you again. Welcome to Earth." She looked up briefly at the blue sky, then back at him, and there was something in that look, something between pride and relief, that he filed away to think about later. "Come in. They're ready for you." The meeting room was on the 4th floor of the facility. It was a medium-sized room with a long table, chairs on both sides, water in pitchers at regular intervals, and windows that looked out over a flat green landscape under the blue sky. The ceiling was the standard height of any working room in any functional building. The lighting was adequate. The coffee, which was offered immediately upon their arrival, was mediocre. The Terran Council was already seated when the delegation entered. There were 11 of them. Veth Saran had prepared for this meeting with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He had studied the available intelligence on the Terran Council, their backgrounds, their positions, their political histories, their public statements over the past decade. He had run scenario analyses. He had prepared for a range of opening postures from the human side, ranging from cautious cooperation to pointed demand-making. He had prepared responses to each scenario. He had spent considerable time on the harder scenarios. He looked at the 11 people seated across the table. They looked tired. Not performatively tired, not the kind of tired that signals importance and sacrifice. Just genuinely, humanly tired. The way people look when they have been working very hard on something for a long time, and the thing is finally happening, and the adrenaline of the preparation has given way to the weight of the moment. The council chair was a man in his mid-60s named Thomas Adeyemi. He had been an infrastructure engineer before entering government, which Prex Toon had flagged as unusual and worth noting. He had been on the Terran Council for 12 years. He had no military background. He had been council chair for 3 years, and his tenure was marked, in their public record, by a single overriding priority: the completion of the Time's Unrelenting Times sister ships and the establishment of the Boundary Monitoring Program. He stood when the delegation entered. The others stood with him. "Admiral Vethsaran," he said. His Keth standard was careful and accented and clearly learned rather than natural. He had learned it anyway. "Thank you for making the journey. Please sit down." They sat. The pitchers of water were passed. The mediocre coffee was distributed. Someone on the human side said something quietly to someone beside them, and the second person laughed softly, and then composed themselves. The room settled. Vethsaran opened the session with the prepared statement. He delivered it well. He had practiced it, which was not something he normally did. But these were not normal circumstances. The statement covered the Dominion's recognition of the contact, their desire to formalize the relationship, their interest in establishing a framework for mutual interaction. He watched the Terran Council listen to it. They listened politely. They nodded in the right places. When he finished, Adeyemi thanked him for the statement and said the Council had reviewed the Dominion's proposed framework document and had some thoughts. Then he put down the formal folder he was holding and folded his hands on the table. "Before we go through the details," he said, "I'd like to say something that isn't in any document." He looked at Vethsaran steadily. 80 years is a long time to not know if someone is coming back. We spent that time doing what we thought was necessary. We are very glad to be sitting at this table. 1. The room was quiet for a moment. "So are we," Vethsaran said, and meant it. The territorial concessions came first. Because the Dominion delegation had prepared them carefully, and leading with a significant offer was sound diplomatic strategy. The document outlined 3 boundary adjustments that expanded the recognized Terran sovereign zone, ceded resource rights in a region of the adjacent sector, and formally withdrew the classification of the Terran system as a quarantine zone. Adeyemi read it. He passed it to the council member beside him, who read it and passed it along. At the end of the table, the last council member read it and looked up. "We appreciate this," Adeyemi said, "but I want to make sure we're not misunderstanding the framing. We're not looking for territory. We have 1 star system and we're still working on it." A small pause. "What we were hoping to discuss is something different." Vethsaran waited. "We want to know what the rules are," Adeyemi said. "How this works. If something threatens us, not you, not Dominion interest, just us. Something we encounter that we can't handle alone, can we ask for help? And if something threatens you, and you need to move through our space, are we partners or are we just in the way?" The Dominion delegation exchanged a look. This was one of the scenarios they had prepared for. It was not the one they had spent the most time on. "You want a mutual defense framework," Vethsaran said. "We want to not be alone," Adeyemi said. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the plainness of someone who had thought about it long enough that all the complicated emotional layers had worn smooth. That's what this was always about. That's why we built what we built. Not to threaten anyone. Not to take anything. We just didn't want to be alone against something we couldn't see coming. Prex Toon was sitting 3 seats down from the Admiral. He was not taking notes. He was just listening, and his expression was the expression of someone whose hypothesis has just been confirmed after a long time of sitting with the uncertainty. The technology sharing proposal went next. The Dominion had prepared an offer of considerable scope: FTL architecture improvements, material science advances, medical technology, communications infrastructure, things that would take a developing civilization decades to reach independently. The Terran Council was interested, genuinely interested, in the practical, specific way of people who had lists of problems they wanted to solve. They asked good questions. They pushed back on 2 items where the Dominion's proposed implementation didn't suit Terran infrastructure. They had clearly done significant preparation of their own, but they were not desperate. That was the thing that quietly reorganized everything the delegation had prepared for. The Dominion had assumed, without stating it explicitly, without examining the assumption that a Class F civilization, encountering a Dominion diplomatic delegation, would approach the meeting from a position of need. That there would be leverage. That the shape of the negotiation would be the shape of all the others, where one side had more and the other side wanted it. The humans wanted things. They were willing to negotiate. But they were not reaching. They had 7 ships. They had 3 more being built. They had 80 years of continuous development behind them. And whatever was in that archive, that intelligence division was still working through. They had built everything they needed to keep building more, and they had done it before the Dominion sat down at this table. And none of what happened at this table was going to change the fact that they had already done it. The leverage question answered itself quietly over the course of the morning. There wasn't any. Not for either side. There were just 2 civilizations sitting at a table trying to figure out how to share a galaxy without the sharing being a problem. It turned out that was not the worst position to negotiate from. The summit broke for the midday meal. The humans had arranged food from several of their regional traditions. The Dominion delegation ate cautiously and found most of it acceptable, and one dish from the West African section of the table, genuinely good, in a way that surprised several people who had not expected to be surprised by food today. Veth Saren stepped outside. The facility had a small garden on the side facing away from the landing platform. Grass, trees, a path. He walked along the path and looked at the sky, which was a color blue that Keth skies were not, and breathed air that was heavier than he was used to. He heard footsteps on the path behind him. He turned. Okafor was there, holding 2 cups of the mediocre coffee. She offered one. He took it. They walked a short distance together without talking. The garden was quiet. The trees moved slightly in a wind he couldn't hear. Just see. The council did well this morning, he said. They've been waiting to have this conversation for a long time, she said. They prepared. So did we. I know. A pause. Your territorial offer was generous. It was genuine. She nodded. I know that too. They reached a bench and stopped. Neither of them sat. They stood beside it and held their coffee and looked at the garden. I want to ask you something, he said. Not for the record. Not for any document. All right. He thought about how to phrase it. He had thought about it on the shuttle down. He had thought about it through the whole morning of the session. It was not a diplomatic question or a tactical question. It was the kind of question that existed in the space between what people said formally and what was actually true. The time's unrelenting, he said. The design. Everything I saw on the tour. I understood it, by the end, as an answer to not knowing why we came and left. The uncertainty. The fear of the worst case. Yes, she said. But I want to understand the fear itself, not the response to it, the thing you were afraid of. He looked at her. What was the worst case? When you imagined the scenario you were building against, what did it look like? She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at the trees moving in the silent wind. The worst case, she said, was that you came back and you didn't ask. She paused. Not war, necessarily. Not an attack. Just arriving and telling us how it was going to be. The way you do, with something you've already decided about. And we would have no say, and no capacity to make a say, and it would just happen to us. She looked at him. We weren't afraid of you specifically, she said. We were afraid of being the kind of civilization that things happen to, that decisions get made about, without being consulted, that gets managed. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. So, we decided we were going to be something else instead. He stood with that for a moment. Something else. Not a threat. Not an aggressor. Not even, at its root, a military power. Just a civilization that had decided, firmly, and at great expense and over a very long time, that it was going to be consulted. That it was going to be at the table, rather than on the agenda. The Times, unrelenting Times, was not a weapon. It was a seat at the table. The biggest, most over-engineered, 9-layered, 8-drive, 6,000 crewed seat at the table that had ever been constructed, built by people who were not going to trust that the invitation would come on its own. He looked at the sky. We should have spoken to you, he said, when we came, 80 years ago. We should have introduced ourselves. Yes, she said, you should have. It was not said with bitterness. It was said the way you acknowledge a true thing. He accepted it the same way. I will make that recommendation formally, he said, for future surveys, for the protocol. She nodded. That would be good. They finished their coffee in silence. The garden was still. Above them, invisible in the blue, the Times, unrelenting Times, was in its parking orbit, with its lights on, and its crew going about their work. In no particular hurry, patient in the way of something that had already done what it came to do. The afternoon session produced the framework document. It took 4 hours. There were disagreements on 3 points, and resolutions on all 3. The mutual defense clause was the longest negotiation, 40 minutes, on the exact language of when the clause activated and who could invoke it. The humans wanted the language broad. The Dominion's legal advisors wanted it specific. They found a middle ground that both sides' lawyers would spend the next decade refining and that would nonetheless hold in the 2 situations it was invoked in over the following century. The technology sharing agreement was straightforward by comparison. The joint research framework was agreed upon in 20 minutes and would eventually produce 11 significant advances that neither civilization would have reached independently. The territorial concessions were revised. The Terran Council declined the original offer and proposed a smaller, more specific adjustment to the boundary zone, one that addressed a practical navigation issue their ships had been working around. It was a more modest ask than the Dominion had prepared for, and the delegation accepted it without hesitation. Adeyemi signed the document with a pen. An actual pen, the kind that left ink on paper. He noticed the Dominion delegation looking at it. "We've been planning to sign this for a long time," he said. "I wanted to use something that would last." He handed it to Saran. The Admiral looked at the pen for a moment. Then he signed. The delegation stayed on Earth for 3 days. There were additional sessions, working group meetings, a formal dinner that was warmer than formal dinners usually were, and several long conversations in corridors and gardens, and around the coffee urns that nobody filed reports on but that mattered as much as anything in the documents. On the final morning, Prextoon sat in a small courtyard and read through the original survey report one more time. He had read it many times in the past weeks. He kept returning to it the way you return to a thing that doesn't make sense yet, waiting for the angle that makes it click. He read the conclusion again. Class F, no threat. Monitoring interval 200 years. He thought about everything that conclusion had missed. Not because it was wrong about the facts. It was right about the facts. It was wrong about the question. He read it one more time. Then he closed the file. He opened his personal log and added the 3rd and final entry he would make about this contact. Below the 2 lines he had written before. The 3 lines together would eventually be published in the Intelligence Division's formal review of the first contact failure, and would be read by every new analyst entering the division for the next 300 years as the first item in their foundational training. The first line, "We forgot to check what they were afraid of." The second line, "They were not hiding, we were not watching." The third line, written in a courtyard on a planet with a blue sky that moved him in a way he had not expected. "What a civilization builds in fear tells you more about it than anything it builds in confidence. We should have asked sooner. We should always ask sooner." He closed the log. The shuttle lifted from the facility in the late afternoon. Saran sat in the forward seat again, the same seat he had taken on the way down, and watched Earth fall away through the viewport. The blue atmosphere thinned to black. The planet curved below them, green and brown and covered in the slow white swirl of weather systems, lit on one side and dark on the other, exactly as it had been when the first survey team saw it 80 years ago, and wrote their report, and went home. The Times' unrelenting Times was visible above them, enormous and patient, holding its orbit. As the shuttle climbed toward it, it grew in the viewport the way it had grown on the approach 2 weeks ago, filling more and more of the frame, until the frame couldn't contain it. He looked at the hull, the layered plates, the running lights, the recessed emplacements and the broad dorsal structures and the sheer mass of the thing, hanging in space around the planet it was built to protect. He thought about 9 layers of armor, the outer 3 designed to be destroyed. He thought about 8 drives running on different physical principles. He thought about 6,000 crew members, enough to keep the ship fighting when half of it was gone. He thought about Adeyemi's pen, the kind that left ink on paper, because they had been planning to sign for a long time. He thought about Okafor in the garden, turning her coffee cup in her hand, saying, "We weren't afraid of you specifically. We were afraid of being the kind of civilization that things happened to." The shuttle passed the Times' unrelenting Times and continued toward the Times' long consideration, smaller and cleaner, and built to the principle that you constructed exactly what you needed and nothing more. He thought that measured escalation was a sound philosophy. He thought it was built on an assumption, the assumption that you understood the situation well enough to measure correctly, that you knew what the situation required. He thought that assumption needed to be examined more carefully. Going forward, he thought that Earth, and the 80 years it had spent answering a question nobody had thought to ask, was a very good reason to examine it. The times-long consideration times filled the viewport. The docking bay opened to receive them. Below, the planet turned slowly in its orbit, blue and green, unremarkable from a distance, going about its business in the way it had been going about its business for 4 billion years, mostly without anyone paying attention. Veth Saran filed a report about the summit on the way home. It was thorough and clear and covered everything that needed to be covered. In the recommendations section, he wrote 3 things. The first was that a permanent diplomatic mission be established on Earth immediately. The second was that the survey protocol be revised to require an introduction, a formal communication to any newly contacted civilization, explaining who the Dominion was, why the survey team had come, and how to make contact if they wished to. The third was that the Terran Sector archive be fully processed and reviewed, and that a standing team be assigned to monitor human open-source communications on an ongoing basis. He paused before the last line of the recommendations. Then he wrote, "Humanity did not surprise us because they were exceptional. They surprised us because we stopped paying attention. The lesson is not about them. It is about us." He saved the report and sent it. The times-long consideration times moved away from Earth, heading home, carrying 43 people, and a signed document, and a lesson that would take the Dominion a generation to fully absorb. Behind them, the Times, unrelenting Times, held its orbit. Its lights were steady. It was in no hurry. It had time.